Welcome, and take a moment to get comfortable. Dim the lights, set your phone down, maybe let the background noise fade just a little. Tonight, we are stepping into a world that feels distant, almost unreal, yet strangely familiar in ways we do not always expect. A world where work was not just a part of life, but life itself. A world of smoke, steel, whistles, and endless motion. Welcome to the American factory floor of the 1920s. At first glance, the 1920s are often remembered as an age of excitement and transformation. Jazz music drifting through crowded clubs. Cities growing taller by the year. New machines promising progress, prosperity, and a brighter future. It is the decade of motion, optimism, and bold ideas. But behind that polished image, far from the glittering dance floors and fashionable parties, there was another America waking up before dawn, an America powered not by celebration, but by exhaustion. This story begins not in a boardroom or a laboratory, but in the echoing halls of massive factories. Buildings that seemed alive long before the sun rose. Their machines already humming, belts turning, gears grinding, waiting patiently for human hands to arrive and keep them fed. For millions of workers, these factories were both livelihood and trap. They offered wages, but demanded everything else in return: time, strength, attention, and often health. Imagine what it meant to work here. The noise alone was overwhelming. Rows of machines pounding metal, stamping parts, cutting, pressing, and shaping materials without pause. Conversations were swallowed by the sound. Thought itself felt heavy, drowned out by constant vibration. The air was thick with heat, dust, and smoke, carrying the scent of oil and iron. Every surface seemed to shimmer with motion or residue from yesterday's labor. This was not work, that slowed down. The machines did not tire. They did not hesitate. And the people working beside them were expected to match that pace hour after hour, day after day. Shifts stretched long, sometimes 10 or 12 hours, sometimes more. Breaks were short or theoretical. Fatigue was not treated as a warning sign. It was seen as weakness. In this environment, productivity became a kind of obsession. Factory owners and managers were not simply interested in getting work done. They wanted to get more work done faster, cheaper, and more efficiently than ever before. Every movement was studied. Every second measured. Workers were timed, observed, and evaluated as if they were extensions of the machines they operated. This was the era of scientific management, a philosophy that believed human labor could be optimized the same way a machine could. If output slowed, it was not assumed that workers were tired, hungry, or overwhelmed. It was assumed something was wrong with the system or with the worker. And systems, after all, could be adjusted. The problem was simple and persistent: human bodies have limits. No matter how precise the stopwatch or how detailed the chart on the wall, people still needed sleep. They still needed food. They still felt pain, boredom, and exhaustion. And when pushed too far, they slowed down. They made mistakes. They fell behind. For factory owners under pressure to meet quotas and maximize profit, this was unacceptable. The machines were capable of endless motion. Why were not the workers? That question led to some unsettling solutions. Instead of reducing hours or improving conditions, many factories looked for ways to push workers beyond their natural limits. The goal was not comfort or safety. The goal was endurance, focus, speed. Anything that could keep hands moving and eyes open just a little longer. And this is where our story takes a turn that feels surprising today, but felt entirely reasonable at the time. In the early 20th century, the line between medicine and enhancement was thin. Substances we now associate with strict controls were once viewed as modern tools, symbols of progress and scientific advancement. Tonics, powders, and elixirs promised energy, clarity, and vitality. They were advertised openly. sold legally, recommended with confidence. In many factories, these substances made their way directly into the workplace. Workers were offered pick-me-ups, small doses of energy, something to help them stay alert, something to help them keep pace with the machines. It was framed as assistance, even care. A modern solution to a modern problem. And for exhausted workers, it was hard to say no. This was not a dramatic exchange. No secret meetings or whispered warnings. The substances were handed out casually, sometimes by supervisors, sometimes by company nurses. They were treated like coffee or vitamins or a routine part of the workday. Take this, and you will feel better. Take this, and the day will go faster. And often, it did. Workers felt sharper, more awake, less weighed down by fatigue. Their hands moved faster. Their focus narrowed. The noise became easier to tolerate. For a few hours, the impossible pace felt achievable. From management's perspective, the results were impressive. Output increased. Absences decreased. Complaints became harder to voice when energy was chemically reinforced. The factory floor moved faster, louder, and more efficiently than before. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. The human cost did not disappear, it was simply delayed. Fatigue returned harder later. Bodies paid the price after the shift ended. Dependency quietly took root. What started as a boost slowly became an expectation. Staying productive without it became harder. Falling behind became more likely. Yet in the moment, none of that mattered. Because tomorrow's problems were less urgent than today's quotas. This is the world we are exploring today. Not a single factory, but a system. Not a single decision, but a mindset. A time when progress was measured in output charts, and the solution to human exhaustion came in a small bottle instead of meaningful change. As we move forward, we will look closer at how these practices became normalized. Why substances like cocaine were once seen as helpful rather than harmful. How factory culture, scientific management, and social attitudes combined to create one of the most unsettling chapters in industrial history. This is not a story about villains twirling mustaches or heroes riding in to save the day. It is a story about systems, about incentives, pressures, and choices made in the name of efficiency. It is about what happens when productivity becomes more valuable than people, and when science is used to push limits instead of respecting them. So take a breath. Let the noise fade just a bit. Because now that you have stepped onto the factory floor of the 1920s, the machines are already running and the shift has only just begun. Before the factory machines ever roared to life, before the whistle sliced through the morning air, the workday had already begun for the people who labored inside those walls. Long before productivity charts, efficiency targets, or chemical solutions entered the picture, there was a quieter, more personal reality that shaped everything that followed. The way workers lived, slept, and woke each day in the 1920s. Imagine opening your eyes not because you feel rested, but because your body has learned to wake itself out of fear. The fear of being late. The fear of losing wages. The fear of falling behind in a system that showed little patience for mistakes. For many factory workers, mornings did not begin with calm or choice. They began abruptly, often in cramped boarding houses or shared apartments where privacy was rare and silence almost non-existent. These living spaces were designed for affordability, not comfort. Rooms were small, sometimes shared by multiple people who worked different shifts. Mattresses were thin. Windows let in cold air during winter and dust during summer. The sounds of coughing, footsteps, and distant street noise blended into a constant background hum. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and easily broken. There was no concept of winding down after work. After long shifts on their feet, workers returned home exhausted, ate whatever simple food they could afford, and collapsed into bed knowing the cycle would repeat itself in a matter of hours. Nights felt short. Rest felt incomplete. And yet, morning always came too soon. When the factory whistle blew at dawn, it was not a suggestion. It was a command. It cut through the city like a blade, echoing down streets and into homes, signaling that time now belonged to the factory. Miss that sound, and the consequences were immediate. Docked pay. Stern warnings. Replacement by someone else who needed the job just as badly. So workers rose, often still tired from the day before. Their bodies ached. Their eyes burned. Muscles stiffened from repetitive motion that never quite healed overnight. There was no time to stretch, reflect, or prepare mentally for the day ahead. Survival left little room for ceremony. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was quick and functional. A slice of bread. A weak cup of coffee. Sometimes porridge, thin and plain. Food was not about enjoyment or nutrition. It was fuel, and not very good fuel at that. There were no balanced meals designed to support physical labor. Calories were cheap. Quality was a luxury. And yet, this inadequate start was expected to carry workers through hours of intense, monotonous effort. Standing at machines. Lifting heavy materials. Repeating the same motions thousands of times. All while maintaining focus, speed, and accuracy. Fatigue was built into the system, yet treated as a personal failure rather than a structural problem. As workers walked toward the factory, often in groups, there was little conversation. Energy was conserved. Everyone knew what awaited them. The massive buildings loomed larger with each step, windows glowing faintly as if the machines inside were already awake. In many ways, they were. Inside, the environment offered no relief. Heat from the machinery made summers unbearable. In winter, drafts cut through the space despite the constant motion. The air carried particles that settled into clothes, hair, and lungs. Over time, it became part of you. Something you stopped noticing because you had no choice. This daily grind shaped not just bodies, but minds. Chronic exhaustion dulled emotions. Days blurred together. The future became difficult to imagine beyond the next paycheck. Dreams narrowed. Ambitions shrank. When every ounce of energy was spent just getting through the day, there was little left to question the system that demanded it. And this is what made workers especially vulnerable to anything that promised relief or at least the illusion of it. By the time factory owners introduced stimulants into the workplace, the ground had already been prepared. Workers were tired enough to accept help from almost anywhere. Skepticism faded in the face of survival. If something made the day easier, even temporarily, it felt like a gift. But it is important to understand that this was not desperation in the dramatic sense. It was quiet, grinding fatigue. The kind that accumulates slowly. The kind that convinces you that feeling exhausted all the time is simply normal. That this is what adulthood, responsibility, and work are supposed to feel like. In this context, the offer of a tonic did not feel dangerous. It felt practical. Modern. Scientific. A small edge in a world that gave you none. Workers were not chasing pleasure or escape. They were chasing the ability to keep up. From management's perspective, the daily exhaustion of workers was an obstacle to be solved, not a condition to be alleviated. The question was not why people were so tired, but how to keep them moving anyway. And because the problem showed up each morning in slow starts, heavy eyes, and lagging output, the solution was expected to work quickly. Chemical energy fit perfectly into this mindset. But the deeper truth is that none of this would have been necessary if the system itself had been designed differently. Shorter hours. Better living conditions. Proper meals. Real rest. These were all possible solutions, but they conflicted with profit margins and production schedules. They required investment, patience, and a willingness to accept limits. Stimulants, on the other hand, were efficient, cheap, immediate. They did not require restructuring the workday or questioning the ethics of endless labor. They simply masked the symptoms. And so, the cycle continued. Workers woke up tired, took something to stay alert, pushed through the day, crashed later, slept poorly, woke up tired again. Over time, this rhythm became normal, expected, invisible. What is haunting about this part of the story is not just the exhaustion itself, but how completely it was normalized. No alarms were raised. No urgent debates took place about the human cost of such routines. Fatigue was treated as a personal issue, not a collective one. This normalization is what allowed more extreme measures to follow. Because once you accept that people should wake up tired and push through anyway, it becomes easier to justify helping them do so by any means necessary. As we move forward in this story, keep this daily reality in mind. The cramped rooms, the shallow sleep, the thin breakfasts, the endless walk toward the factory gates. These were not side details, they were the foundation upon which everything else was built. The stimulants did not create the problem. They exploited it. And the tragedy lies not just in what was given to workers, but in what was never offered instead: rest, dignity, and the simple recognition that human beings are not machines no matter how much the system wanted them to be. If the morning revealed how little rest workers received, the workday itself explained why that rest never seemed to be enough. Sleep deprivation was not an occasional hardship in 1920s factory life, it was a permanent condition. A background state so common that few people questioned it. Being tired was not something that happened after a difficult week. It was simply how life felt. From the moment workers stepped onto the factory floor, their bodies were asked to perform against their own limits. The work was repetitive, demanding, and unforgiving. The same motions, over and over, hour after hour. Lifting, pulling, pressing, assembling. There was little variation and even less room for slowing down. Machines set the pace, and humans were expected to follow. This kind of labor drained energy in a way that modern people often underestimate. It was not just physical effort. It was mental strain as well. Workers had to stay alert to avoid mistakes that could damage materials, slow production, or draw the attention of supervisors. A moment of distraction could cost wages or reputation. In some cases, it could end a career. And yet, the body can only stay alert for so long. As hours passed, fatigue settled in. Muscles weakened. Focus narrowed. Reaction time slowed. But instead of recognizing these signs as natural warnings, factory culture treated them as obstacles to overcome. If someone slowed down near the end of a shift, it was not assumed they were exhausted. It was assumed they lacked discipline. There were no quiet rooms. No structured rest periods. Breaks, when they existed, were short and tightly controlled. Workers sat, drank water, maybe ate something small, and then returned to the noise. The expectation was clear: recovery should happen on your own time, not on company hours. The problem, of course, was that there was barely any time left for recovery. By the time workers left the factory, their bodies were already depleted. Walking home felt longer than it had that morning. Muscles ached with a deep, dull soreness that sleep alone could not fix. Hands cramped. Backs stiffened. Some workers carried minor injuries that never fully healed, because there was no chance to let them. Evenings passed quickly. There were chores to do, food to prepare, maybe family responsibilities to attend to. For many, the idea of leisure was theoretical. By the time they lay down, exhaustion took over almost instantly, but the quality of sleep was poor. Pain, noise, stress, and anxiety kept rest shallow and fragmented. This pattern repeated day after day, slowly eroding resilience. Chronic sleep deprivation does not announce itself loudly. It creeps in. It makes everything harder while convincing you that this is simply how things are. Workers grew accustomed to heavy eyes, slow mornings, and constant aches. Over time, they stopped expecting to feel refreshed. And this had consequences beyond physical discomfort. Fatigue dulls judgment. It narrows emotional range. It reduces the ability to question or resist. When you are always tired, you focus on getting through the day, not on imagining alternatives. Complaints feel like extra effort. Change feels unrealistic. The system benefits when people are too exhausted to challenge it. Factory owners did not necessarily plan for this psychological effect, but they certainly took advantage of it. In management offices, productivity charts told a different story. Output dipped during certain hours. Errors increased late in the day. Absences followed particularly long shifts. To executives trained to think in numbers, these were not signs of human limits. They were inefficiencies. So the question became, how do you keep people alert when their bodies are clearly saying no? This is where sleep deprivation quietly reshaped expectations. Instead of adjusting schedules to allow more rest, factories adapted their demands. Staying awake became part of the job. Fighting fatigue was considered a skill, not a warning sign. Workers learned small tricks. Splashing water on their faces. Pinching themselves. Drinking more coffee. Standing when sitting was not required. Anything to stay functional. But these methods only went so far. Eventually, exhaustion always won. That is when chemical solutions began to look attractive. Stimulants promised what sleep no longer could. Alertness. Energy. Focus. Not in the long term, but right now during the hours that mattered most to production. They did not solve fatigue. They covered it up. They allowed workers to perform despite being exhausted, which made exhaustion seem manageable. From the outside, it looked like progress. People stayed on task longer. Output increased. The system appeared to work. But inside the body, the cost accumulated. Sleep debt grew. Natural rhythms were disrupted. Workers found it harder to rest even when given the chance. The body, once pushed beyond its limits repeatedly, stopped responding normally. Deep rest became elusive. Mornings felt worse, not better. And yet, because this decline was gradual, it rarely triggered alarm. There was no single breaking point. Just a slow normalization of strain. What is striking is how little sleep was valued in this environment. Rest was framed as laziness. Needing sleep was seen as weakness. The idea that productivity might depend on proper recovery was almost absent from industrial thinking at the time. Machines did not sleep. Why should people? This mindset ignored a basic truth. Unlike machines, human performance declines without rest. You can force output temporarily, but you can't cheat biology forever. The body always keeps score. By treating sleep deprivation as acceptable, factories created a problem that stimulants could temporarily solve. But in doing so, they locked workers into a cycle that only grew more demanding over time. Each boost required recovery that never came. Each exhausted day made the next one harder. And still, the machines kept running. As we continue this story, remember that the use of stimulants did not begin in a vacuum. It emerged from a world where rest had already been stripped away. Where being tired was normal. Where pushing through exhaustion was praised. Chemical energy did not replace sleep, it replaced the expectation that workers deserved it. And once that expectation disappeared, it became easier to ask for more. More hours. More focus. More output. All while giving less in return. This is the quiet foundation beneath everything that followed. A system built on fatigue, sustained by denial, and accelerated by substances that promised relief but ultimately deepened the problem. Next, we will look at how poor nutrition and inadequate meals made this cycle even harder to escape and why hunger, exhaustion, and stimulants formed a perfect triangle of dependency on the factory floor. By the time exhaustion and sleep deprivation had become an accepted part of daily life, there was another weakness quietly undermining workers from the inside out: food. Or more accurately, the lack of it. Nutrition in the 1920s industrial workforce was not designed to support long hours of demanding physical labor. It was designed to be cheap, filling enough to survive, and nothing more. For factory workers, meals were rarely something to look forward to. Food was functional. It existed to quiet hunger, not to restore strength. Breakfasts were thin and repetitive, lunches were rushed, and dinners depended entirely on what wages allowed. There was no careful balance of nutrients, no understanding of how food affected long-term energy or recovery. Hunger was common. Weakness was expected. The morning meal, if there was one, often consisted of stale bread, leftover porridge, or a cup of weak coffee. Protein was scarce. Fresh produce was unreliable. Many workers started their shifts already running on empty, hoping that adrenaline and habit would carry them through the hours ahead. The idea that breakfast should prepare the body for physical labor simply was not part of working-class reality. Lunch did not offer much relief. Breaks were short, and food options were limited. Workers brought simple meals from home: bread, maybe cheese, perhaps a small piece of meat if they were lucky. Some factories had nearby vendors selling cheap food, but quality was inconsistent. Meals were eaten quickly, often standing or sitting on hard surfaces, surrounded by noise and pressure. There was no time to digest, no chance to relax. Food went in, work resumed immediately. By mid-afternoon, energy levels dropped sharply. This was not a mystery. Bodies deprived of rest and proper nutrition naturally slowed down. Blood sugar dipped. Muscles weakened. Focus faded. And once again, this decline was treated not as a signal to stop, but as a problem to solve. Hunger and fatigue fed into each other. Poor meals made exhaustion worse. Exhaustion made it harder to prepare better meals. Workers lacked the time, money, and energy needed to improve their diet. Even those who understood that food mattered had little power to change their situation. From management's point of view, nutrition was not their responsibility. Wages were paid. What workers ate outside the factory was considered a personal matter. Yet the effects of undernourishment showed up clearly on the factory floor: slower movement, lower output, more mistakes. And once again, the response was not to address the root cause. Instead of providing better meals or longer breaks, factories leaned further into short-term solutions. Stimulants became more appealing in a workforce already weakened by hunger. When your body lacks fuel, anything that creates the illusion of energy feels powerful. This is where the combination became especially dangerous. Sleep deprivation, physical fatigue, and poor nutrition formed a perfect storm. Each problem intensified the others. And in the middle of it all, chemical stimulants stepped in as a false answer. Workers did not necessarily understand why the tonics worked. They only knew that after taking them, hunger felt distant. Fatigue became manageable. Focus sharpened. The body felt lighter, faster, more capable, at least for a while. In reality, these substances did not replace nutrition. They bypassed it. They forced the body to keep going without the resources it needed. It was like pressing harder on the accelerator when the fuel tank was nearly empty. For management, the results looked good. Productivity rose. Complaints about tiredness and hunger became less frequent. Output stabilized during hours that previously lagged. The system appeared more efficient. But efficiency came at a cost that was not immediately Visible. Undernourished bodies pushed beyond their limits do not recover easily. Muscles break down faster. Immune systems weaken. Minor illnesses linger longer. Injuries heal more slowly. Over time, workers became more vulnerable, not less. Yet because stimulants masked these effects, the decline remained hidden. Workers showed up. Machines kept running. The numbers looked acceptable. What makes this chapter of the story especially unsettling is how normalized it all was. Hunger was common, enough to be unremarkable. Eating poorly was not considered a crisis. It was just life. And when something came along that made hunger easier to ignore, it was welcomed rather than questioned. There was also a social element to this acceptance. Many workers came from backgrounds where scarcity was familiar. Economic insecurity shaped expectations. If life had always involved making do with little, then working through hunger did not feel unusual. It felt responsible. Factories benefited from this mindset. The less workers expected, the easier it was to give them substitutes instead of solutions. And so, poor nutrition remained a constant undercurrent. It weakened the workforce while making them more dependent on artificial energy. The worse meals became, the more effective stimulants seemed. The more stimulants were used, the less urgent proper food appeared. This feedback loop tightened quietly. By the time factory owners formally introduced energy programs or workplace tonics, they were not introducing something foreign. They were offering an answer to problems workers already felt in their bodies every day. The ache, the hunger, the heaviness, the sense that no amount of rest or food ever quite restored what work took away. But again, this was not a solution built to last. You can't nourish a workforce with chemicals alone. You can't replace food with stimulation and expect no consequences. Eventually, something has to give. What is striking is how rarely anyone stopped to ask whether productivity itself had become the problem. Instead of questioning the demand for constant output, factories focused on pushing human limits further. When bodies faltered, they were not protected, they were modified. As we continue forward, the picture becomes clearer. Stimulants did not appear suddenly or mysteriously. They slid naturally into a system already weakened by exhaustion and hunger. They promised efficiency without change, performance without care. And for a while, that promise seemed to hold. Next, we will look closely at how these substances were introduced and normalized inside factories, how tonics were framed as modern, helpful tools, and why so many workers accepted them without resistance. By the time stimulants entered the factory floor in an organized way, the conditions were already set. Workers were tired before the day began, drained by long hours, weakened by poor nutrition, and accustomed to pushing through discomfort without complaint. In that environment, the arrival of tonics did not feel radical. It felt practical, almost inevitable. These substances were rarely introduced as drugs. That word carried discomfort, uncertainty, and risk. Instead, they were presented as tonics, supplements, or energy aids, part of a modern, forward-thinking approach to labor. Labels used language that sounded scientific and reassuring. Words like revitalizing, restorative, and invigorating appeared often. The message was simple: this would help you do your job better. The way these tonics were distributed mattered. They were not sold in dark corners or exchanged secretly between workers. They were handed out openly. Sometimes by supervisors. Sometimes by company nurses or medical staff employed by the factory. The setting gave them legitimacy. If the factory itself was offering this, it could not be harmful. That was the assumption. For many workers, this was their first experience with something that directly altered how they felt during the workday. The effect was noticeable. Within a short time of taking the tonic, fatigue lifted. The fog in the mind cleared. The body felt lighter, faster, more responsive. The noise of the machines seemed easier to tolerate. Time passed more quickly. In a world where relief was rare, this felt like a gift. What is important to understand is that workers did not see this as being pushed beyond their limits. From their perspective, they were finally being given something to help them meet expectations that already existed. The job had not changed. The hours had not shortened. The workload had not eased. The tonic simply made it possible to keep up. That framing made acceptance easy. Management reinforced this perception carefully. Tonics were described as optional, even benevolent. No one was forced, at least not explicitly. But when workers who took them performed better, earned praise, or avoided reprimand, the message was clear. Participation had advantages. Over time, choosing not to take the tonic felt like choosing to struggle. This is how normalization happens. Not through orders, but through incentives. Not through fear alone, but through relief. Workers who used the tonics were seen as energetic, dependable, and productive. Those who did not were more likely to lag behind, draw attention, or face subtle pressure to improve. And because the substances worked quickly, they built trust. Immediate results are persuasive. The long-term effects were invisible in the moment. There was no instant harm, no dramatic warning. Just energy where there had been none. In the broader cultural context of the early 20th century, this trust made sense. Cocaine and similar stimulants were not universally viewed as dangerous. They appeared in medicines, toothache drops, and even popular consumer products. Doctors prescribed them. Advertisements praised them. Society saw them as tools of progress. Factories were simply extending that logic into the workplace. What was rarely discussed was the difference between occasional use and daily reliance. A substance that feels helpful once can become necessary when used repeatedly. The body adapts. Natural energy systems weaken. What once felt like a boost becomes the baseline. Workers began to notice that mornings felt worse without the tonic. Focus slipped faster. Fatigue hit harder. This was not framed as dependency, it was framed as proof of how effective the tonic was. See how much it helps, became the narrative, rather than why does it feel so hard without it. From management's viewpoint, the program was a success. Output stabilized. Late day slowdowns decreased. Absences dropped. Complaints about tiredness became less frequent. The factory ran more smoothly. But this smoothness came at the cost of autonomy. When energy comes from a bottle rather than from rest, food, and reasonable hours, control shifts. Workers no longer regulate their own limits. The system does. And the system has little interest in stopping early. What makes this stage of the story especially unsettling is how gentle it appears on the surface. There were no dramatic confrontations. No visible cruelty. Just small bottles, friendly explanations, and the promise of making hard days easier. Yet this kindness was conditional. It existed only to the extent that it improved performance. The tonics did not address why workers were exhausted. They did not challenge the structure of the workday. They did not restore health or prevent burnout. They simply made exhaustion productive. And once exhaustion becomes productive, there is no incentive to eliminate it. Workers adjusted quickly. The tonic became part of the routine, like punching the clock or washing hands before a shift. Some talked about it casually. Others relied on it silently. It blended into daily life until it felt normal. This normalization blurred important boundaries. The line between care and control faded. What looked like support functioned as pressure. What felt like choice slowly became expectation. And still, very few people questioned the ethics of it. Because in the short term, everyone seemed to benefit. Workers got through the day more easily. Managers hit their targets. The factory prospered. The problem with short-term benefits is that they hide long-term costs. As reliance increased, so did tolerance. Some workers needed larger amounts to feel the same effect. Others felt irritable or drained when the stimulant wore off. Sleep became more difficult. Appetite changed. The cycle tightened. But these changes unfolded quietly, individually. There was no collective alarm. Each person experienced their own version of decline, often assuming it was a personal failing rather than a systemic one. And that is how the system protected itself. By framing tonics as help, factories avoided asking harder questions. Why are people this tired? Why do they need chemical assistance to meet expectations? What would happen if we slowed down? Those questions threatened profit. Tonics did not. As we move forward, we will see how this dependence deepened, how stimulants became not just helpful, but necessary, and how the culture of efficiency turned chemical endurance into a workplace norm rather than an exception. Because once the body is no longer allowed to say enough, the system will keep asking for more. By the time stimulants were quietly normalized on the factory floor, one key detail remained deliberately obscured: what was actually inside them. Workers were rarely given full explanations. Ingredients were vague, labels technical, and questions discouraged not through force, but through culture. In an environment where authority was rarely challenged and survival depended on compliance, curiosity felt risky. The tonics were described in broad, reassuring terms: energizing, restorative, scientifically developed. These phrases created confidence without providing information. For most workers, that was enough. Trust was not built on transparency. It was built on results. If something made the day easier, if it helped them keep up, then the details seemed less important. This was not a time when ingredient disclosure was standard. Consumer protections were limited. Many medicines contained powerful substances without clear labeling. The public largely trusted manufacturers, doctors, and institutions. Factories benefited from that trust. In some cases, workers suspected the tonics were strong. They could feel it: sharp focus, sudden energy, racing thoughts. But suspicion did not automatically lead to resistance. Modern work required modern solutions. If science could make machines faster, why not people? This mindset allowed stimulants including cocaine or derivatives to be used without alarm. At the time, these substances were not universally viewed as dangerous. They appeared in medical treatments, dental products, and everyday remedies. Risks were underappreciated. Benefits were emphasized. Factories leaned into this ambiguity. Minimal explanation avoided difficult conversations. Management did not have to justify chemical assistance, acknowledge dependency, or confront ethical concerns. For workers, the lack of information created detachment. The tonic became a tool, not a substance to analyze. Take it, feel the effect, move on. There was no language to describe concern, little time to reflect. Normalization deepened, something powerful became mundane. Over time, workers noticed patterns: the tonic worked quickly, wore off predictably, the day felt heavier without it. These observations stayed personal, rarely discussed. There was no forum for collective questioning, no safe space to compare experiences. Even if someone wondered what they were taking, the question often ended there. Knowing the answer did not change the reality of the workday. Refusing the tonic meant struggling. Accepting it meant surviving. Choice was theoretical. Management understood this. By not forcing workers, factories avoided overt responsibility. Participation was technically voluntary, but non-participation was costly. Falling behind was visible. Productivity tracked. Comparisons constant. Those who declined risked being labeled slow, unreliable, or difficult. Most complied quietly. The hidden ingredients also protected the illusion of safety. If something is not named, it is harder to fear. Cocaine, stripped of identity and framed as energy, lost its edge. It became abstract, harmless sounding, clinical. Workers could distance themselves emotionally from what was happening in their bodies. Changes in mood, sleep, or appetite were attributed to stress, age, or bad luck, not the tonic. Without clear information, cause and effect blurred. From the factory's perspective, ambiguity was ideal. Productivity gains remained high. Questions remained low. The system functioned smoothly. But beneath the surface, subtle shifts were occurring. Some workers slept poorly. Others felt restless or irritable during off hours. Appetite changed. Emotions flattened or intensified. These effects were rarely dramatic but accumulated. Exhaustion masked side effects. Hunger hid imbalance. Stress explained everything else. Lack of transparency prevented informed consent, though that term was not widely used. Workers could not weigh risks they did not know existed. They could not make meaningful choices. Bodies became sites of experimentation without acknowledgement. What is unsettling is how calmly this unfolded. No mass protests. No scandals. No public outrage. The practice slipped into routine because it aligned with existing values: efficiency, obedience, faith in progress. Factories did not need to lie aggressively. They simply did not explain. This silence reveals power. Those who controlled information controlled the narrative. Those who needed wages accepted what they were given. A system quietly reshaped human limits. As science and regulation evolved, these practices came under scrutiny. But during the 1920s, they existed in a gray zone: legal, accepted, largely unquestioned. And that gray zone is where consequential decisions are made. By the time concerns surfaced, damage was woven into daily routines. Dependence had formed. Expectations shifted. Enduring the workday without chemical assistance felt increasingly unrealistic. This is the danger of hidden systems. When people do not know what they are part of, they can't resist it. When effects are gradual, they feel normal. When productivity improves, moral questions are postponed. Key point 6 reveals the core issue. The problem was not just the substance. It was absence of knowledge, imbalance of power, and the quiet replacement of consent with necessity. Next, we will examine how these effects manifested on the factory floor, how behavior shifted, how coworkers noticed subtle differences, and how chemical endurance reshaped the very culture of work itself. Once stimulants were woven into daily routines, their effects became visible almost immediately, not in dramatic or chaotic ways, but in subtle shifts across the factory floor. The change was not announced. It was observed. Movements grew sharper. Hands worked faster. Faces looked more alert, even when bodies were clearly worn down. From the outside, it looked like progress. Workers who had struggled through the final hours of a shift now stayed active longer. The usual midday slowdown softened. Machines that once outpaced human rhythm now felt easier to follow. Supervisors noticed fewer pauses, fewer mistakes, fewer signs of lagging focus. For management, these changes were proof that the system worked. But the energy was not natural. The alertness stimulants created was narrow and intense. Workers described feeling locked in, focused on the immediate task in front of them, less aware of time passing or discomfort in their bodies. This kind of concentration had benefits: repetitive work felt smoother, less mentally draining. The noise faded into the background. The day seemed to move faster. Yet this focus came with trade-offs. Conversations became shorter. Expressions flattened. Laughter was rare. Some workers appeared restless, constantly moving even when stillness would have made more sense. Others grew irritable, snapping at small frustrations. These changes were not disruptive enough to draw attention, but they subtly reshaped the social atmosphere. The factory floor became quieter, not because conditions improved, but because workers were more inwardly focused. From management's perspective, this emotional flattening was useful. Fewer complaints. Less visible fatigue. Less resistance. A workforce absorbed in tasks is easier to manage than one that questions them. Coworkers noticed differences among themselves. Those who regularly took the tonic seemed faster, more driven, sometimes even competitive. Others felt pressure to match that pace, whether or not they used the stimulant. The baseline for acceptable performance shifted upward. This is one of the most powerful effects of artificial energy. It changes expectations for everyone. When some workers can push beyond natural limits, the system recalibrates. What once counted as hard work becomes the new normal. Falling short is no longer about exhaustion, it is about effort. And effort, in this environment, was treated as a moral quality. Those who struggled without stimulants felt increasingly inadequate. The work had not changed, but their ability to meet its demands had. Some eventually began using the tonic not because they wanted to, but because they felt they had to. This pressure was not written down. It was not spoken aloud. It lived in glances, comparisons, and performance charts. In a place where output was measured constantly, differences were hard to ignore. Over time, stimulants did not just increase productivity, they reshaped identity. Being a good worker meant being fast, focused, and tireless. Needing rest became invisible. Slowing down became suspicious. And yet, beneath the surface, the body was keeping score. The sharp focus created by stimulants often came at the expense of broader awareness. Workers were more likely to miss subtle warning signs: strain in a muscle, dizziness, mounting stress. Attention narrowed to the task, not the body performing it. This increased the risk of errors over time, even as short-term output improved. But those risks were not immediately obvious. The numbers still looked good. And numbers were what mattered. When the stimulant wore off, the contrast was harsh. Fatigue returned quickly and deeply. Some workers felt drained, emotionally flat, or unusually irritable after shifts. Sleep became more difficult. The body struggled to switch off after hours of artificial alertness. These effects rarely stayed connected to the tonic in workers' minds. They blamed stress, noise, life outside the factory. Without clear information, it was hard to draw the connection. Management, meanwhile, focused on what they could see during work hours. And during those hours, performance improved. This selective attention allowed the system to continue unchecked. Benefits were immediate and measurable. Costs were delayed and personal. In environments driven by output, delayed costs are easy to ignore. Another subtle shift occurred in how time was experienced. With stimulants dulling fatigue signals, long shifts felt shorter. This made extended hours easier to justify. If workers could stay alert longer, why not run the machines longer too? And so, the system adjusted once again. Overtime became more acceptable. Demands increased slightly, then gradually more. Each increase felt manageable because artificial energy filled the gap. But each step pushed workers further from natural limits. This escalation rarely felt like a sudden change. It felt like adaptation. What is striking is how little resistance emerged at this stage. Not because workers were unaware, but because the immediate experience felt easier than before. When a solution reduces suffering in the short term, it earns loyalty even if it deepens the underlying problem. The factory floor became a place where exhaustion was hidden rather than eliminated. Where energy was borrowed rather than restored. Where performance mattered more than sustainability. And once that culture took hold, it reinforced itself. New workers learned quickly what was expected. The pace. The focus. The endurance. Those expectations were not explained, they were demonstrated. To fit in, you adapted. To succeed, you pushed through. The stimulant was not the cause of this culture, but it accelerated it. It allowed the system to demand more without appearing cruel. It masked strain behind efficiency. This is the quiet danger of artificial solutions to human problems. They do not challenge the system that creates the problem. They help it run more smoothly. By this point in the story, the factory no longer simply consumed labor. It optimized it chemically. Human limits became adjustable variables. Energy was no longer something workers managed themselves, it was something the system provided and controlled. As we continue, we will look at how management formalized these practices, how productivity programs framed chemical endurance as innovation, and how scientific language was used to justify pushing workers further than ever before. Because once artificial energy proves effective, it does not stay optional for long. As stimulants proved effective on the factory floor, management began to do what it always did with anything that increased output: formalize it. What started as an informal aid slowly became part of a broader philosophy of work, one rooted in efficiency, measurement, and control. This was the age of scientific management, and it offered the perfect language to justify what was happening. Scientific management promised order in a chaotic, industrial world. Every motion could be analyzed. Every task optimized. Every second accounted for. Workers were no longer just people performing jobs. They were variables in a system designed to maximize results. Charts replaced intuition. Stopwatches replaced judgment. And now, chemistry joined the toolkit. In this framework, stimulants were not moral questions, they were inputs. Management did not talk about pushing people beyond their limits. They talked about reducing inefficiency. They did not describe exhaustion. They described performance dips. The human body was reframed as something that could be calibrated, tuned, and improved, just like a machine. Tonics were presented as innovations. Evidence of progress. A sign that the factory was modern and forward-thinking. If workers felt tired, it was not because the system was flawed, it was because their energy levels needed adjustment. This language mattered. It stripped the situation of emotion and ethics. Once endurance became a metric, there was no room to ask whether it should be demanded in the first place. Managers held meetings, reviewed data, and noted improvements after tonic programs were introduced. Output curves smoothed. Downtime shrank. Errors appeared more predictable. These results reinforced the belief that the approach was not only effective but responsible. And because the system was framed as scientific, it carried authority. Science implied neutrality, objectivity, progress. Questioning it felt irrational or backward. Workers, meanwhile, absorbed this logic without ever being invited into it. They were not asked whether chemical endurance felt right or sustainable. Their role was to perform. The system would decide what was necessary. This shift changed how responsibility was understood. If a worker collapsed from exhaustion, it was not the system's fault. The system had provided support. If someone struggled, they simply had not adapted well enough. Scientific language turned human strain into personal failure. Over time, this mindset reshaped expectations permanently. The baseline for productivity rose. What had once required extraordinary effort became standard. New hires were trained into a pace that previous generations would have found extreme but now felt normal. And because stimulants helped meet those expectations, there was no incentive to lower them. This is the paradox of efficiency-driven systems. Every improvement becomes an excuse to demand more. There is no finish line. Only the next optimization. In this environment, slowing down was not just impractical, it was illogical. Why reduce output when tools existed to maintain it? Why shorten hours when people could stay alert longer? Why redesign work when chemistry could solve the problem faster? Scientific management did not see people suffering. It saw numbers behaving as intended. Yet behind the charts and graphs, the cost continued to accumulate. Bodies wore down. Dependence deepened. The distance between what workers felt and what the system acknowledged grew wider. But because everything was working on paper, there was little motivation to change. Key point 8 shows us something crucial. Stimulants were not a rogue practice or a desperate measure. They fit perfectly into the dominant ideology of the time. They were the logical outcome of a worldview that valued output above all else and believed that human limits were obstacles, not boundaries. And once endurance is systematized, it stops being a choice. As stimulants and scientific management reshaped the rhythm of factory life, their influence spread beyond individual bodies and into the social fabric of the workplace. The factory floor was no longer just a place of shared labor. It became a space of quiet comparison. Productivity was not only tracked by managers, it was felt between workers, subtly and constantly. Before these changes, exhaustion had been a shared experience. Everyone slowed down together. Everyone felt the weight of long hours and heavy work. There was an unspoken understanding that fatigue was part of the job, and that struggling did not make you weak, it made you human. That shared reality created a kind of solidarity, even in difficult conditions. But artificial energy disrupted that balance. When some workers could maintain speed and focus longer than others, differences became more visible. The gap was not always large, but it was enough to be noticed. One person finished tasks faster. Another rarely asked for short pauses. Someone else seemed unaffected by late-day fatigue. These differences did not need to be explained out loud. They spoke for themselves. Comparison crept in quietly. Workers began to watch each other more closely, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Falling behind had consequences. Being seen as slow or unreliable could affect shifts, pay, or job security. In an environment where survival depended on performance, awareness of others' output became unavoidable. This awareness created pressure not imposed directly by management, but generated within the group itself. Those who relied on tonics often did not boast about it. There was no pride in chemical endurance. But their performance set a new standard. Even workers who preferred not to use stimulants felt compelled to keep up. The baseline for acceptable effort shifted upward without ever being formally announced. And because this shift happened gradually, it felt natural. Social relationships changed as a result. Conversations during breaks became shorter and more guarded. Complaints were less openly shared. Admitting exhaustion felt risky when others appeared unaffected. Vulnerability faded, replaced by quiet endurance. This erosion of openness mattered. When people stop talking honestly about how they feel, systems lose an important feedback loop. Fatigue becomes invisible. Strain goes unreported. Problems do not disappear, they go underground. Competition did not take the form of open rivalry. It was subtler than that. It lived in self-comparison. In silent questions like, why can they keep going and I can't? The answer, increasingly, was chemistry, but that was not always acknowledged. This internalized pressure made resistance harder. When stress comes from peers as much as from supervisors, there is no clear target to push back against. The system reinforces itself through social dynamics. Management benefited from this without having to intervene. Workers pushed themselves and each other, raising output organically. Fewer directives were needed. The culture did the work. But the cost was a loss of mutual support. In environments where everyone is struggling equally, people look out for one another. In environments where performance varies sharply, empathy gives way to comparison. It becomes harder to admit weakness when strength is rewarded so visibly. Over time, this dynamic reshaped how workers saw themselves. Identity became tied to output. Self-worth became linked to speed, focus, and endurance. Needing rest felt like failure. Depending on stimulants felt normal. This is one of the most profound effects of chemical productivity. It changes not just what people can do, but how they judge themselves and others. New workers entering the factory absorbed these values quickly. They learned the pace by watching others. They learned what was expected without being told. If they struggled, the solution was not to ask why the work was so demanding, it was to find a way to adapt. The tonic offered that adaptation. And because everyone was adapting individually, collective questioning faded. There was no shared moment of realization. No clear line where the system crossed from demanding to exploitative. It happened incrementally, quietly, through countless small adjustments. What makes this stage of the story especially powerful is how human it is. No one needed to act with cruelty. No one needed to enforce compliance aggressively. People simply responded to incentives, pressures, and examples around them. Yet the outcome was the same, a workforce pushing itself beyond sustainable limits, with chemistry smoothing the path. As the culture shifted, so did memory. Workers who had once known a slower pace began to forget it. What had once felt extreme now felt ordinary. And what felt ordinary became expected. This loss of perspective is one of the most lasting effects of such systems. When people no longer remember what reasonable work feels like, it becomes difficult to imagine alternatives. By the time this stage was fully established, stimulants were no longer just tools for productivity. They were embedded in identity, relationships, and expectations. The factory was not just managing labor, it was shaping behavior and self-perception. And all of this happened without dramatic conflict. That is what makes it so effective and so troubling. As we move toward the final parts of this story, we will look at the broader realization that slowly emerged over time, how the long-term effects became harder to ignore, how regulations began to change, and how history eventually re-evaluated these practices. Because while systems can ignore human limits for a while, they can never erase them completely. To understand why all of this was possible, we had to step back from the factory floor and look at the wider world of the early 20th century. The use of stimulants at work did not exist in isolation. It reflected how society at large viewed these substances at the time, and that view was very different from how we see them today. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cocaine was not automatically associated with danger, addiction, or social harm. Instead, it was often framed as modern, scientific, and even beneficial. Doctors prescribed it. Pharmacists sold it. Advertisements praised it. It appeared in tonics, powders, and remedies meant to treat fatigue, pain, low mood, and lack of focus. For many people, cocaine represented progress. Medicine in this era was still evolving. Regulation was limited, and the boundaries between treatment, enhancement, and experimentation were blurry. If a substance made people feel better, more alert, or more capable, it was often considered useful, especially if respected institutions endorsed it. This cultural acceptance mattered deeply. When factory owners introduced stimulant-based tonics, they were not asking workers to trust something radical. They were asking them to trust the same kind of products they already encountered in daily life. The factory simply became another place where modern medicine was applied. Workers might have used similar products outside of work for headaches, tooth pain, or fatigue. Seeing them offered in a workplace setting did not feel like a violation. It felt consistent with the times. This social context lowered resistance almost entirely. There were no widespread public warnings. No strong stigma. No shared language to describe long-term risk. The idea that a substance could be both helpful in the short term and harmful over time was not yet fully integrated into public understanding. As a result, early warning signs were easy to dismiss. If someone felt restless, irritable, or unable to sleep, it could be blamed on stress or noise. If energy crashed later in the day, That was just hard work taking its toll. Without a clear narrative connecting these effects to stimulants, the dots remained unconnected. Factories benefited enormously from this gap in understanding. By aligning workplace practices with mainstream medical beliefs, management avoided scrutiny. They were not acting outside social norms, they were participating in them. And as long as society viewed stimulants as legitimate tools, questioning their use at work felt unnecessary. This acceptance also delayed regulation. It took time, decades, in some cases, for medical research, public awareness, and policy to catch up with lived experience. Only after patterns of harm became undeniable did attitudes begin to shift. By then, stimulant use had already shaped work culture, expectations, and bodies. What is important here is not to judge the past by modern standards, but to recognize how powerfully cultural beliefs shape behavior. When society tells you something is safe, useful, and modern, it becomes much harder to question its presence, especially when it seems to make life easier. In factories, this meant that chemical endurance was not seen as exploitation. It was seen as innovation. And innovation carries moral weight. It suggests improvement, intelligence, and inevitability. To resist it is to appear outdated or ungrateful. This belief system protected the practice long enough for it to become embedded. Only later, when medical knowledge expanded and regulations tightened, did the story change. Substances once praised became restricted. What was once advertised became controlled. What was once normal began to look reckless in hindsight. But during the period we are exploring, none of that was obvious. Factories were not hiding in shadows. They were operating in plain sight, supported by a culture that celebrated efficiency, science, and progress, often without asking who paid the price. This reminds us that systems do not exist in a vacuum. Workplace practices reflect societal values. And when society undervalues rest, transparency, and human limits, those blind spots show up everywhere, including on the factory floor. As we move toward the final stages of this story, we will see how these practices eventually began to unravel, how long-term consequences surfaced, how regulations slowly emerged, and how history re-evaluated an era that tried to chemically engineer productivity. Because while normalization can delay consequences, it can never erase them. By the time stimulant use had become quietly accepted inside factories, another powerful idea was spreading just as fast: scientific management. Often associated with Frederick Winslow Taylor, this philosophy promised to transform industry by replacing intuition with measurement, tradition with data, and human judgment with efficiency studies. On paper, scientific management sounded reasonable, even noble. It aimed to eliminate waste, improve productivity, and create predictable systems. Every movement could be studied. Every task could be optimized. Every second could be accounted for. But there was a hidden cost. In practice, scientific management reduced workers to variables in an equation. The human body was no longer seen as complex, emotional, or fragile. It became a machine with inputs and outputs, something to be tuned, accelerated, and pushed closer to its theoretical maximum. Factories timed how long it took to lift a tool, turn a bolt, or walk from one station to another. They measured fatigue not by how a worker felt, but by how output declined. If productivity dropped, the assumption was not that the system was too demanding, it was that the worker was not optimized yet. This mindset created a dangerous logic. If machines could be lubricated to run smoother, why not people? If engines needed fuel to maintain power, why not workers? If output could be increased by reducing friction, why not remove human limits altogether? Stimulants fit perfectly into this worldview. They were not seen as drugs, but as efficiency tools. Chemical solutions to biological constraints. A way to keep the human machine operating at a consistent pace, regardless of exhaustion, hunger, or emotional strain. Under scientific management, rest was reframed as inefficiency. Breaks were calculated, not compassionate. Sleep was treated as a variable outside the factory's responsibility. What mattered was what happened on the floor, how fast hands moved, how long attention held, how rarely output dipped. When stimulants allowed workers to maintain speed longer, they validated the system's assumptions. Management could point to the numbers and say, "See, the model works." But the numbers hid what was not measured. They did not capture anxiety. They did not capture emotional numbness. They did not capture the quiet toll of forcing alertness when the body demanded rest. Scientific management excelled at measuring what it valued: speed, consistency, volume. It failed entirely at measuring what it ignored: well-being, dignity, sustainability. Over time, workers internalized these expectations. If productivity was the ultimate measure of worth, then slowing down felt like failure. Needing rest felt like weakness. Declining a stimulant felt like refusing progress. The system did not need constant enforcement. It taught people to police themselves. This is where chemical productivity became truly powerful. It did not just push bodies harder, it reshaped identity. Workers began to define themselves by output, by endurance, by how much they could give before breaking. Scientific management offered a clean, logical story: efficiency equals success. But it stripped away context. It treated people as interchangeable parts rather than living systems with limits. And once people are seen as components, replacing them becomes easier. If a worker burned out, another could take their place. The system remained intact. The numbers stayed strong. The factory kept moving. What made this era especially dangerous was how convincing it looked. Charts, graphs, and time studies gave exploitation the appearance of objectivity. Harm was not intentional, it was collateral, hidden behind data. Key point 11 shows us how ideology matters as much as tools. Stimulants alone did not create this reality. They thrived because scientific management had already redefined what work was supposed to be. The chemicals simply helped workers meet expectations that were never humane to begin with. And once those expectations were normalized, stepping outside them felt impossible. This philosophy would eventually face criticism, reform, and resistance. But for a long time, it shaped not just factories, but modern work culture itself, leaving traces we can still recognize today. In the final key point, we will look at what happened when the costs could no longer be ignored, when bodies, communities, and history pushed back against a system that treated human limits as flaws to be erased. For years, the system appeared to work. Factories ran faster. Output increased. Schedules tightened. From the outside, it looked like a triumph of modern industry, proof that science, management, and chemistry could reshape human labor into something endlessly productive. But beneath that surface, pressure was building. Human bodies are remarkably adaptable, but they are not infinitely flexible. The same substances that masked fatigue and sharpened focus in the short term quietly drained resilience over time. The system demanded consistency, but biology responded with imbalance. Workers began to feel changes they could not easily explain. Energy came in sharp bursts, followed by deep crashes. Concentration became harder to sustain without assistance. Sleep grew lighter, shorter, and less restorative. Irritability crept in, then emotional flatness. People felt alert but disconnected, present but distant from themselves. At first, these effects were treated as personal issues. A worker struggling to keep pace was labeled lazy or unreliable. Someone showing agitation or withdrawal was seen as difficult. The possibility that the system itself was causing harm rarely entered the conversation. But patterns do not stay invisible forever. As years passed, factories saw rising turnover, accidents, and long-term health problems. Injuries increased not because workers were careless, but because bodies pushed past exhaustion make mistakes. Attention can be forced, but coordination cannot be endlessly sustained. Communities felt the ripple effects. Families noticed changes at home: shorter tempers, restless nights, emotional distance. Workers came back drained, unable to fully recover before the next shift. Life narrowed to a cycle of work, fatigue, and recovery that never quite worked. Medical professionals slowly began connecting the dots. Reports accumulated. Observations repeated. What once seemed like isolated cases started to form a pattern. Substances that boosted performance were also undermining stability. Productivity came at the cost of long-term well-being. Public perception began to shift. The same society that once celebrated chemical energy started to question it. Stories of harm gained attention. Regulations tightened. Ingredients that had once been openly advertised became restricted, then controlled. The narrative changed from progress to caution. But change came slowly, and not without resistance. Industries rarely abandon systems that increase output voluntarily. Regulation followed damage, not prevention. History moved reactively, not proactively. By the time meaningful limits were introduced, generations of workers had already paid the price. What is striking is how familiar this pattern feels. Again and again, innovation promises efficiency without cost. Again and again, harm is minimized until it becomes undeniable. The language changes only after consequences can no longer be ignored. Key point 12 forces us to confront a hard truth. Systems built on overriding human limits will always demand repayment. The bill may not arrive immediately. It may be delayed, distributed, or hidden. But it always comes through bodies, through families, through communities. This story is not just about factories in the past. It is about how easily productivity becomes a moral value, and how quickly tools designed to help can become instruments of pressure. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it echoes. When we look back at this era, the lesson is not that science or management were mistakes. It is that any system that treats human limits as obstacles rather than signals is destined to fail people eventually. The factory floors of the 1920s remind us that progress without care is not progress at all. And if there is one final takeaway from this story, it is this: productivity can be measured, but humanity cannot, and when we forget that, the cost is always higher than expected. Looking back at the journey we have explored today, from the initial drive for efficiency to the unintended consequences that unfolded over time, one thing becomes clear: progress is never purely technical. Every innovation, every shortcut, every new method carries with it both promise and responsibility. While science and management reshaped labor and pushed boundaries, the human cost reminds us that people are not machines. Understanding history is not just about remembering facts, it is about learning to balance ambition with care, speed with well-being, and results with humanity. Thank you all for joining me on this journey through time, technology, and the human experience. If today's story gave you insight, reflection, or simply curiosity, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and take care of yourselves and each other.